The fluorescent lights of Atlanta International Airport cast a harsh glow on Dr. Marcus Thompson's tired face as he rushed through the crowded terminal. It was 9:15 p.m. on a busy Friday evening, and he had just finished a complex 16-hour emergency surgery that attested every bit of his expertise as a neurosurgeon. His comfortable gray hoodie and well-worn jeans stood in stark contrast to the crisp business suits around him. Dark circles under his eyes told the story of a man who had been standing in an operating room since dawn, fighting to save a young patient's life. His short-trimmed beard showed hints of gray, not from age, as he was only 38, but from the stress of carrying the weight of countless lives in his skilled hands. Marcus walked quickly, his backpack slung over one shoulder and a small carry-on rolling behind him. Inside the backpack were crucial medical documents he needed for tomorrow's surgery in Boston. Another critical patient was waiting for him there, a 7-year-old girl with a rare brain condition that few surgeons were qualified to treat. As he passed a coffee shop, the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee tempted him, but he knew he couldn't spare even 5 minutes. His flight was scheduled to depart in less than an hour, and he still needed to get through security. The last flight to Boston. If he missed it, a child's life could hang in the balance. People streamed past him in both directions, some running to catch their flights, others dragging their feet after long journeys. A family with small children caught his eye, reminding him of tomorrow's patient. A little girl in Boston had the same bouncy pigtails as the child who just walked past him, and the thought made his heart heavy with responsibility. Marcus checked his phone again. 3 missed calls from Boston General Hospital. He would call them back once he got through security. His colleagues were anxiously awaiting his arrival, and the surgery was scheduled for early tomorrow morning. There was no room for delay. The walk to the security checkpoint seemed longer than usual. Perhaps it was the exhaustion seeping into his bones, or maybe it was the knowledge that another challenging surgery awaited him. His feet felt like lead, each step a reminder of the many hours he'd spent standing in the operating room earlier that day. As he approached the security line, Marcus pulled out his ID and first-class boarding pass. The airline had upgraded him automatically, a perk of his frequent flyer status from flying across the country for special cases. He'd earned those miles saving lives, though he never thought about it that way. A group of businessmen in front of him discussed their upcoming meeting in loud voices. Behind him, a young mother tried to calm her crying baby. Marcus smiled at her sympathetically. He'd seen countless parents in similar situations at his hospital. The baby's cries reminded him of the pediatric ward where he spent most of his days, bringing hope to families in their darkest hours. Just then, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his sister, praying for tomorrow's surgery. "You got this, big bro." Marcus smiled, feeling grateful for his family's constant support. They understood why he missed so many holiday gatherings and family events. Saving lives didn't follow a convenient schedule. As the security line inched forward, Marcus mentally reviewed the procedure he would perform tomorrow. Each surgery was different, each patient unique, but his approach remained the same: careful, methodical, and precise. His colleagues often joked that he could perform complex procedures in his sleep, but Marcus never took any operation lightly. Every patient deserved his complete attention and best effort. Finally reaching the front of the security line, Marcus began the familiar routine of removing his shoes and placing his belongings in the gray plastic bins. His movements were automatic, practiced from years of frequent travel. The TSA agent checking IDs greeted him with a tired smile, which he returned warmly. Everyone working tonight, like him, was just trying to do their job. Little did Marcus know that in the next 30 minutes, his ordinary evening would turn into something completely unexpected. His identity as a top neurosurgeon wouldn't matter once he reached the gate. All some people would see was a black man in casual clothes trying to board first class. And that's where the real story would begin. Dr. Marcus Thompson reached gate B7 with 20 minutes to spare before his Boston flight. The boarding area was crowded with tired travelers, most of them scrolling through their phones or dozing in uncomfortable chairs. A small line had already formed at the priority boarding lane, where business people in expensive suits waited patiently. Sarah Miller, the gate agent working that evening, had been with the airline for 15 years. She prided herself on knowing who belonged in first class, and her eyes narrowed as she watched Marcus approach the priority line. His gray hoodie was wrinkled from his long day in surgery, and his jeans, though clean, were far from the usual first-class attire. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah called out sharply, her voice cutting through the general murmur of the gate area. "The regular boarding line is over there." She pointed to the longer line forming on the other side of the pole markers. Marcus stepped forward, pulling out his first-class boarding pass and ID. "I understand, but I have a first-class ticket," he explained calmly, holding out his documents. Sarah barely glanced at the boarding pass. "Are you sure you're in the right line?" she asked, her voice getting louder. "This is for our priority passengers only." Several nearby travelers looked up from their phones, drawn to the developing scene. "Yes, I'm sure," Marcus replied, still maintaining his professional composure despite his exhaustion. "I'm a frequent flyer with your airline. Could you please check my boarding pass?" Instead of taking his documents, Sarah crossed her arms. "How did you get a first-class ticket?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. An elderly couple in line exchanged uncomfortable glances. "I fly frequently for work," Marcus explained, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I'm a surgeon, and I have an important operation scheduled in Boston tomorrow morning." Sarah laughed dismissively. "A surgeon? In that outfit?" Her voice dripped with skepticism. More people were watching now, some discreetly pulling out their phones to record the interaction. A young woman in line spoke up. "He showed you his boarding pass. What's the problem?" Sarah ignored her, focusing instead on her computer screen. "Sir, there seems to be an irregularity with your ticket. I'll need you to step aside while I verify some information." Marcus checked his watch anxiously. The surgery team in Boston was waiting for him, and every minute of delay increased the risk for tomorrow's young patient. "Please, just scan my boarding pass. You'll see everything is in order." "If you continue to be disruptive," Sarah threatened, her finger hovering over a button under her desk, "I'll have to call security." A businessman behind Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Ma'am, he's being perfectly calm. I don't see any disruption." Sarah's face flushed red. "Sir, please mind your own business. This is an airline security matter." More phones were recording now. A teenage girl whispered to her mother, "This isn't right, Mom. They're only doing this because he's black." Marcus took a deep breath, remembering all the times he'd faced similar situations. As a black doctor, he'd learned to handle prejudice with dignity, but tonight was different. A child's life literally depended on him making this flight. "Miss Miller," he said, reading her name tag, "I understand you're doing your job, but I'm also trying to do mine. I'm a neurosurgeon heading to Boston Children's Hospital for an emergency surgery. Please, just scan my ticket." Sarah's hand moved to the security button. "Sir, if you don't step aside immediately, I'll have no choice but tow." She was interrupted by a notification sound from the gate computer. The screen showed Marcus's frequent flyer profile, Diamond Elite status, over 200,000 miles flown that year alone. But instead of apologizing, Sarah's face hardened. "These credentials must be a mistake. I'm calling security to verify your identity." As she reached for her phone, Marcus could only shake his head in disbelief. In just a few hours, he was supposed to be performing delicate brain surgery, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal for trying to board a plane he had every right to be on. The confrontation was about to escalate in ways nobody in the crowded gate area could have predicted, and the next few minutes would change not just Marcus's evening, but the policies of an entire airline. Two airport security officers approached Gate B7 with quick, purposeful strides. Officer Mike Chen, a 10-year veteran of airport security, and his partner, Officer James Wilson, had received a call about a disruptive passenger, a description that seemed odd as they observed the calm, well-spoken man at the gate. Dr. Marcus Thompson stood exactly where he had been for the past 10 minutes. His boarding pass still extended towards Sarah Miller, the gate agent who had called security. Around him, the terminal had transformed into an impromptu arena, with at least 20 passengers holding up their phones to record the unfolding scene. "Is there a problem here?" Officer Chen asked, his eyes moving between Marcus and Sarah. Before Marcus could speak, Sarah jumped in. "This man is insisting he has a first-class ticket, and he's refusing to move to the regular boarding line. He claims to be a surgeon," she added with obvious disbelief. Marcus turned to face the officers, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the growing audience. Officers, I have a valid first-class ticket and proper identification. I'm a neurosurgeon heading to Boston for an emergency surgery tomorrow morning. A small crowd had gathered now. Among them was Janet Cooper, a middle-aged teacher who had been grading papers nearby. She stood up, clutching her iPad. I've been watching this whole thing. This gentleman has done absolutely nothing wrong. He's been polite while she's been horrible to him. Officer Wilson held up his hands. Everyone, please stay calm. Sir, could we see your identification and boarding pass? Marcus handed over his documents. As Officer Chen examined them, more airline staff began gathering around the gate desk. A supervisor named Tom Bradley hurried over, his face tense as he noticed the number of passengers recording the incident. His ID could be fake, Sarah insisted, leaning over to look at Marcus's driver's license. And that boarding pass might be altered. We need to do a thorough verification. An angry murmur rippled through the crowd. A young black businessman in line removed his AirPods and spoke up. Oh, so now we're forging medical licenses and airline tickets? Just say what this is really about. Officer Chen studied Marcus's ID carefully. Sir, you said you're heading to Boston for surgery. Yes, Marcus replied, checking his watch again. I have a 7-year-old patient waiting. She needs a specialized neurosurgical procedure that can't be delayed. I just finished another surgery here in Atlanta. Sarah scoffed loudly. A surgeon in a hoodie? Please, he probably bought it at one of those costume shops. The crowd's reaction was immediate and angry. Several passengers began shouting at Sarah, while others moved closer to show their support for Marcus. The gate area had become a powder keg of tension. Tom Bradley, the supervisor, finally stepped forward. Ms. Miller, perhaps we should. No, Sarah interrupted. I know first-class passengers when I see them. Something isn't right here. She turned to the officers. Can you escort him away from the gate? He's disrupting the boarding process. Marcus felt a mix of frustration and despair. Every minute of delay put his young patient at greater risk. He pulled out his phone, considering whether to call Boston Children's Hospital to explain the situation. Officer Wilson noticed Marcus's hospital ID card in his wallet. Sir, is that a medical ID? But before Marcus could answer, 3 more airline staff members arrived, followed by what appeared to be the terminal manager. The scene had grown into a full-blown incident. Passengers in line began sharing the video clips on social media. Someone in the crowd shouted, "This is going viral. Airline racism caught on camera." The terminal manager, a woman in her 50s named Patricia Martinez, assessed the situation with growing alarm. The last thing the airline needed was another viral video of discriminatory treatment. Just as Patricia opened her mouth to speak, Marcus's phone began to ring. The caller ID showed Boston Children's Hospital, emergency. The simple act of his phone ringing was about to change everything, but not before Sarah made one final, catastrophic mistake. That's probably his accomplice, she declared loudly, pointing at his ringing phone. This is a security issue now. Officers, remove him from the gate. The next 60 seconds would not only change the course of Marcus's evening, but would also trigger a national conversation about racial profiling in air travel. And it would all start with a desperate phone call from a hospital hundreds of miles away. As Dr. Marcus Thompson's phone continued to ring, the crowd at Gate B7 fell into an expectant silence. The bright screen clearly displayed Boston Children's Hospital, emergency, for anyone close enough to see it. I need to take this call, Marcus announced firmly, his professional demeanor finally showing cracks of urgency. It's about my patient. Don't answer that. Sarah Miller, the gate agent, demanded. But it was too late. Marcus had already pressed the speaker button, his hands slightly shaking from exhaustion and stress. Dr. Thompson, a frantic female voice filled the gate area. This is Nurse Rebecca Chen from Boston Children's. We have an emergency with Sophie. The voice echoed clearly through the terminal speakers, causing several nearby passengers to lean in closer. Marcus spoke clearly into the phone. I'm on speaker, Nurse Chen. What's happening with our patient? Sophie's intracranial pressure is rising, the nurse explained urgently. Dr. Williams says we can't wait until morning for the surgery. The whole surgical team is being called in early. We need you here as soon as possible. You're the only pediatric neurosurgeon on the East Coast qualified to perform this specific procedure. The gate area became so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Sarah Miller's face had turned pale, her mouth slightly open in shock. Nurse Chen, Marcus replied professionally. Despite the chaos around him, I'm currently being detained at Atlanta International Airport. The gate agent and security officers are questioning the validity of my first-class ticket and medical credentials. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. Then, what? But Dr. Thompson, you're one of the most renowned pediatric neurosurgeons in the country. Your research paper on innovative pediatric brain surgery techniques was just published in the New England Journal of Medicine last month. Several passengers who had been recording the incident exchanged meaningful looks. A woman in a business suit whispered to her companion, "I just Googled him. He's actually famous in the medical world." The nurse continued, her voice growing more desperate. "Dr. Thompson, Sophie's parents are here. They flew in from California specifically because you're the only surgeon they trust with their daughter's life. Should I put them on the phone?" Officer Chen, who had been listening intently, lowered his clipboard. "Ma'am," he addressed Sarah, "I believe we've made a serious mistake here." But the revelations weren't over. A distinguished-looking woman in scrubs pushed through the crowd. "Marcus? Marcus Thompson? Is that really you?" The new voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Watson, Chief of Medicine at Atlanta General Hospital. She had been hurrying to catch her own flight when she heard the commotion. "I thought I recognized your voice," Dr. Watson exclaimed. "Everyone, this man just spent 16 hours saving a 5-year-old boy's life in my operating room. The surgery he performed today was so complex that only 3 surgeons in the country could have done it." The crowd erupted in murmurs and gasps. Sarah Miller's face had now transitioned from pale to bright red. The terminal manager, Patricia Martinez, stepped forward, her expression a mix of horror and embarrassment. Meanwhile, Nurse Chen was still on speaker. "Dr. Thompson, Sophie's stats are getting worse. The surgical team is prepping the OR. Please tell me you're getting on that plane." Marcus looked directly at Sarah Miller, his voice steady but stern. "My patient is 7 years old. She has a rare brain condition that requires immediate surgery. Every minute we waste here decreases her chances of a full recovery. Now, would you like to scan my boarding pass, or shall we continue questioning my credentials while a child's life hangs in the balance?" The videos that captured this moment would later show Sarah Miller's complete transformation from aggressive authority to mortified submission. Her hands trembled as she finally reached for his boarding pass. Officer Wilson turned to his partner. "Make sure Dr. Thompson gets priority escort to his seat." As the truth of Marcus's identity swept through the terminal like a tidal wave, the same passengers who had witnessed his humiliation now burst into spontaneous applause. But Marcus took no pleasure in the vindication. His mind was already in Boston, reviewing the complex procedure that awaited him. The next few minutes would see an airline scrambling to make amends, but more importantly, they would determine the fate of a young girl whose life depended on the very man who had just been treated like an imposter. The atmosphere at Gate B7 transformed dramatically in the next few minutes. Dr. Patricia Watson, the chief of medicine who had recognized Marcus, took command of the situation with the authority that came from decades of running a major hospital. "I want every single person here to understand exactly who they've been mistreating," Dr. Watson announced, her voice carrying across the terminal. She pulled out her tablet and quickly brought up the Atlanta General Hospital's website. "Dr. Marcus Thompson isn't just any surgeon. He's literally the person other neurosurgeons call when they can't figure out what to do." The terminal manager, Patricia Martinez, was now frantically speaking into her phone. "Yes, sir, I understand the severity. Yes, he's a VIP passenger. No, sir, I don't think a simple apology will be enough this time." Sarah Miller stood frozen behind her desk, her face a mix of horror and shame as Dr. Watson continued speaking. "Just this morning, Dr. Thompson performed a surgery that most doctors would have deemed impossible. That little boy he saved, 3 other hospitals had turned him away, saying nothing could be done." A young flight attendant rushed forward with a bottle of water for Marcus, while another brought him a fresh pillow for the flight. The same staff who had viewed him with suspicion minutes ago were now falling over themselves to help. "Dr. Thompson," Officer Chen said, his tone completely transformed, "please allow us to escort you onto the plane immediately. We'll make sure your carry-on is properly stored in first class." But Marcus held up his hand. "Just a moment," he said, still speaking to Nurse Chen on his phone. "Rebecca, I'm about to board. Please tell Dr. Williams I'll need the latest scan results sent to my tablet. And make sure Sophie's parents know I'm on my way." As he ended the call, a well-dressed man stepped forward from the crowd. "Dr. Thompson, I'm Richard Bennett, the airline's regional director. I was in my office upstairs when I received multiple urgent calls about this incident." He glanced nervously at the many phones still recording. "On behalf of the airline, I want to express our deepest—" "Mr. Bennett," Marcus interrupted quietly, "I appreciate what you're about to say, but right now, my only concern is getting to Boston. A 7-year-old girl needs surgery that apparently only I can perform. Can we ensure that happens first?" Richard nodded vigorously. Of course, of course." "Sarah," he turned to the gate agent, who flinched at hearing her name, "print out new boarding passes for every passenger in first class. Dr. Thompson gets the best seat, and everyone else will be reseated accordingly." A businessman in an expensive suit who had been waiting in the first-class line stepped forward. "No need to reseat me. Dr. Thompson can have my seat. It's in the front row with extra legroom. He clearly needs the rest more than I do." Others in first class quickly echoed the sentiment, but Marcus politely declined. "Please, everyone keep your assigned seats. I just need to get to Boston." Dr. Watson placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I'll make some calls to Boston Children's. We'll have everything ready for you the moment you land. And Marcus?" She smiled warmly. "That boy you operated on today, he opened his eyes an hour ago. His mother hasn't stopped crying tears of joy." The crowd broke into spontaneous applause again, but this time it was different. Not just supportive, but reverent. They were finally seeing what Sarah Miller had failed to see. Not just a black man in a hoodie, but a brilliant surgeon who saved children's lives. As airline staff began the boarding process, Sarah Miller stepped out from behind her desk. Her voice trembled. "Dr. Thompson, I don't know what to say." Marcus looked at her tired face, seeing not just prejudice now, but also the weight of her terrible mistake. "Ms. Miller," he said gently, "I hope this experience teaches you something valuable. Excellence, dedication, and humanity don't wear a uniform. They come in all colors, dressed in all kinds of clothes." The entire gate fell silent, his words hanging in the air. Several people wiped tears from their eyes, and more than a few reached for their phones to share his powerful message on social media. As Marcus finally walked toward the jet bridge, the impact of what had just happened began rippling through the airport. But for him, the most important journey was still ahead. A young girl in Boston was waiting for the miracle that only his skilled hands could perform. The videos of Dr. Marcus Thompson's ordeal at Gate B7 spread across social media like wildfire. By the time his flight reached cruising altitude, the first clip had already reached 1 million views on Twitter. The hashtag Dr. in a hoodie was trending nationwide. Inside the first-class cabin, Marcus sat quietly reviewing his patient's medical files on his tablet. The flight attendants had dimmed the lights around his seat so he could concentrate, and a "Do Not Disturb" sign had been placed on his seat. Every few minutes, another passenger would walk past, either heading to or from the bathroom, each one stealing a respectful glance at the doctor who had handled discrimination with such dignity. Jennifer Torres, the lead flight attendant, approached his seat softly. "Dr. Thompson, the pilot asked me to inform you that we've been given priority status. We'll be landing in Boston 15 minutes ahead of schedule." Back at Atlanta International Airport, the scene was far from quiet. Sarah Miller sat in the airline's HR office, tissues scattered across the desk in front of her. Her hands shook as she watched the viral videos of herself on a laptop screen. In one clip, which had already been viewed 2 million times, she could be heard saying, "A surgeon in a hoodie? Please." The airline's PR team had assembled for an emergency midnight meeting. Janet Morris, the head of communications, rubbed her temples as she addressed her tired staff. "The videos are everywhere. CNN wants to run it as their lead story for the morning news. The New York Times is already working on a feature about racial profiling in air travel. We need to get ahead of this." Meanwhile, in the terminal, Dr. Patricia Watson was giving an impromptu interview to a local news crew that had rushed to the airport. "Dr. Thompson is exactly the kind of physician we all aspire to be," she explained, her voice full of emotion. "Today, he spent 16 hours saving a child's life, and instead of resting, he's flying across the country to save another one. The fact that he was judged by his clothes rather than his character shows how far we still have to go as a society. The airline's CEO had been woken up at his home in Dallas. He sat in his home office, watching clip after clip of the incident, each one worse than the last. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from board members and major shareholders. This wasn't just a PR disaster. It was a moment that would force the entire airline industry to confront its ongoing issues with racial bias. Social media continued to explode with reactions. Celebrities were sharing the videos and commenting. Other black professionals began sharing their own similar experiences under hashtag Dr. in a Hoodie. Medical associations across the country started issuing statements of support for Dr. Thompson. In the airport security office, officers Chen and Wilson were filing their incident reports. In 15 years on this job, Officer Chen said, shaking his head, "I'd never felt so ashamed of how we handled the situation." The terminal manager, Patricia Martinez, was dealing with her own crisis. Passengers from other gates had been filming their reactions to the viral videos, creating a second wave of social media content. One video showed a group of doctors and nurses in the terminal removing their white coats and ID badges, standing in their casual clothes, holding signs that read, "What does a doctor look like?" Sarah Miller's computer screen filled with new notifications. The video had reached international news outlets. Headlines were appearing in multiple languages. Distinguished surgeon racially profiled at U.S. airport. Life-saving doctor humiliated over hoodie. Viral video exposes airline's racial bias. As midnight approached, the airline's legal team huddled in their corporate office, preparing for what would likely be a massive lawsuit. But they didn't know what the security cameras had captured just before the incident. Dr. Thompson, exhausted from surgery, had stopped to help an elderly passenger who had dropped her medications, taking time to organize them and explain each prescription to her despite his own urgent schedule. That video would emerge tomorrow, adding another layer to the story and showing that even before the incident, even when no one was watching, Dr. Marcus Thompson had been exactly who he claimed to be, a dedicated physician who put others first, regardless of how he was treated in return. The aftermath was just beginning, but one thing was already clear. This incident would become a turning point in how the airline industry addressed its deep-rooted biases, all because one man in a hoodie had shown them exactly what real professionalism looked like. 24 hours after the incident, Dr. Marcus Thompson stood in front of Boston Children's Hospital's press room, still wearing his surgical scrubs. He had just completed a successful 7-hour surgery on young Sophie, but now he faced a different kind of challenge, addressing the media storm that his airport experience had created. "Before I take any questions," Marcus began, his voice showing signs of exhaustion but remaining clear and professional, "I want everyone to know that Sophie's surgery was successful. She's in recovery now, and her prognosis is excellent." He smiled softly. "That's what really matters today." The room was packed with reporters from every major news network. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, and international media outlets had all sent their top correspondents. Camera flashes lit up the room as Marcus continued speaking. "I've seen the videos," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I've read the headlines. But I want to turn this incident into something positive. This isn't just about one gate agent or one airline. It's about the unconscious biases we all carry." Meanwhile, back in Atlanta, the airline's corporate headquarters was in crisis mode. Their stock had dropped 12% since the market opened. Major corporate customers were threatening to cancel their contracts. The CEO, James Morrison, had just finished recording an emergency video statement. "We have failed," Morrison admitted in the video, which would soon be played on every flight and posted across social media. "We failed Dr. Thompson, we failed our values, and we failed society. But this will be a turning point for our airline." The video cut to Sarah Miller, the gate agent who had asked to speak. Tears ran down her face as she addressed the camera. "I didn't see Dr. Thompson that night. I saw what I expected to see based on my own prejudices. Because of my actions, a child's life was nearly put at risk." Back in Boston, Marcus responded to a reporter's question about pressing charges. "No," he said firmly, surprising many in the room. "I'm not interested in punishments. I'm interested in change. That's why I've accepted the airline's invitation to help develop their new staff training program." The announcement created a buzz in the press room. Marcus held up his hand for quiet. Every employee of the airline will now go through a comprehensive bias awareness program. But here's what makes this different. It will be taught by professionals of color sharing their real experiences. Doctors, lawyers, executives, teachers, people who faced similar situations. In Atlanta, Sarah Miller was sitting in her first training session. The instructor was a black female judge who had once been mistaken for a custodial worker in her own courtroom. As the judge shared her story, Sarah wiped fresh tears from her eyes, finally beginning to understand. At Boston Children's Hospital, Sophie's parents stood up in the press room. Sophie's father, his voice shaking with emotion, addressed the reporters. If Dr. Thompson had missed that flight because of this incident, my daughter might not be alive today. Think about that. Think about how close prejudice came to costing a child's life. The room fell silent. Marcus stepped forward again. But she is alive, he said gently. And that's why we need to focus on moving forward. The airline has agreed to create a scholarship fund for minority students entering medical school. They're committing $50 million over the next 10 years. Social media exploded with this news. The hashtag Dr. In a Hoodie evolved into hashtag FutureDocs in Hoodies as minority medical students began posting photos of themselves in casual clothes with their white coats. A reporter raised her hand. Dr. Thompson, do you regret wearing casual clothes to the airport that day? Marcus smiled, reaching into his bag and pulling out the gray hoodie that had caused such controversy. This hoodie was a gift from a patient's family, he explained. Their son survived a brain tumor that 4 other surgeons had deemed inoperable. They gave it to me because during the weeks of their son's treatment, they said they never saw me in anything but scrubs. They wanted me to have something comfortable to wear on my days off. He paused, letting his words sink in. I wear it proudly. As cameras flashed again, Marcus's phone buzzed. It was a message from Sophie's nurse. The young girl was awake and asking for her doctor. Without another word, Marcus nodded to the reporters and left the podium. The press conference could wait. His patient needed him. The response to the incident was still unfolding, but one thing was clear. Sometimes the most powerful changes come not from anger or retaliation, but from turning a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for education and growth. 1 year after the incident at Atlanta International Airport, Dr. Marcus Thompson stood at a podium again, but this time in a very different setting. The airline had transformed its main training center into a state-of-the-art educational facility, and today was the graduation ceremony for its first class of fully retrained staff. Sarah Miller sat in the front row, no longer a gate agent, but now one of the airline's chief diversity trainers. The woman who had once profiled a black doctor was now teaching others how to recognize and overcome their own biases. She looked different, not just older, but wiser, her eyes carrying both the weight of her past mistake and the pride of her personal growth. 1 year ago, Marcus began, looking out at the assembled crowd. A moment of prejudice almost prevented a life-saving surgery. Today, I'm happy to report that not only is young Sophie thriving, she just won her school's science fair with a project about brain surgery. He smiled as gentle laughter filled the room. The changes that had sprung from that night went far beyond a single airline. The hashtag Dr. In a Hoodie movement had sparked a national conversation about appearance-based bias in professional settings. Major hospitals had revised their policies about doctor dress codes during on-call hours. Medical schools had added specific courses about racial bias in healthcare. In the audience sat Dr. Patricia Watson from Atlanta General, who had been instrumental in establishing the new $50 million scholarship fund. Already, 100 minority students have received full medical school scholarships. They called themselves the Hoodie Scholars, wearing their casual clothes proudly alongside their white coats. But the most significant change, Marcus continued, isn't in policies or procedures. It's in minds and hearts. He gestured to a wall where hundreds of letters were displayed. These are letters from people sharing their own stories of being judged by their appearance. They come from doctors, lawyers, professors, CEOs, accomplished professionals who have faced similar situations. The airline's new training program had become a model for other companies. Instead of traditional diversity training videos, they now brought in successful professionals of color to share their experiences. The impact was immediate and profound. Employees connected with real stories in ways they never had with traditional training methods. Sarah Miller stood up to share her part of the story. Dr. Thompson could have ended my career that night, she said, her voice strong despite the emotion. Instead, he showed me a different path. He taught me that the best response to ignorance is education. The airline's statistics told the story of change. Customer complaints about racial bias had dropped by 90%. Employee satisfaction scores had reached all-time highs. The company had even seen an increase in profits as their new reputation for inclusivity attracted both customers and talented job applicants. Marcus pulled out his famous gray hoodie, now framed in a glass case. "This will hang here in the training center," he announced, not as a reminder of shame, but as a symbol of transformation. It represents how a moment of darkness became a catalyst for light. Sophie, now 8 years old and fully recovered, had drawn a picture that hung next to the hoodie. It showed her doctor in his casual clothes, wearing a superhero cape. Underneath, in a child's handwriting, it read, "Heroes don't need fancy clothes." The ceremony concluded with a surprise announcement. The airline had created a new annual award, the Thompson Excellence in Humanity Award, to be given to employees who demonstrated exceptional commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect. As Marcus left the training center that evening, he passed a young black medical student in a hoodie, rushing to catch his flight. The gate agent smiled warmly, checked his ticket, and wished him a pleasant journey. It was a small moment, but it represented everything Marcus had hoped to achieve. In his car, Marcus checked his phone. There was a message from another airline, asking him to help develop their diversity training program. Below that was an email about a speaking engagement at a medical conference, titled "Breaking Bias in Healthcare." And finally, a photo from Sophie's parents, their daughter proudly standing next to her science fair project, wearing a miniature doctor's coat over a gray hoodie. Marcus smiled, thinking about how a moment that could have ended in bitterness had instead sparked a movement of positive change. The incident hadn't just impacted an airline or an industry. It had reminded people everywhere that true character isn't worn on the outside, but carried within. He started his car, ready to head to the hospital for his next surgery. He was wearing scrubs now, but his hoodie hung in his office, no longer just a comfortable piece of clothing, but a symbol of how one person's dignity in the face of prejudice could help transform countless lives.